Who do you think you are, and do you know who I am, are perhaps two of the worst questions we could ever ask. Both show contempt for the person being addressed and a complete lack of humility on our part. Both questions are intended to insult the other person while elevating ourselves. And we all know it, which is why videos of people asking such rude and condescending questions become viral. They just go viral because they're bad. These people are so obviously oblivious to how they sound, but so sure of their own specialness that they just plow ahead, whether it works or not. Recently, I saw a video of a judge berating a police officer who had pulled him over. Eventually, he was let go, but the video was online and he's had to explain how his behavior wasn't out of line and that he wasn't using his position to get out of a ticket. Well, whether he was honest and sincere or just bluffing with false humility to cover his bad behavior is irrelevant. His reputation has been tarnished and will never be the same. In fact, he may have hurt his reputation more by his post-exposure defense. If he had just come out and admitted that he was out of line and owed the officer an apology, along with the community that he serves, he may have enhanced his standing. But because the video exposes a man who is out of control and acting in an indefensible manner, his effort to defend it didn't help. Because pride, sprinkled with a little bit of contempt for others, often leads to ugliness, and then more ugliness to cover the original ugliness. It just gets ugly all the way around. Ugly, ugly, ugly. Well, today's study on our Who, What, and Why Monday will let us look into the heart of a man whose ugliness was seen in his confrontation with Moses. While we'll examine his actions, the main focus will be answering his version of the two questions that we just addressed. Who do you think you are, and don't you know who I am? Let's look at Exodus chapter 5. Go back to the second book in the Bible, all the way back to Genesis, then turn over to the book of Exodus. It's the second book in the Old Testament, and we're going to read verse 5, or look at chapter 5 and read from it. There we meet Pharaoh, who, like the judge on the video, asked those two terrible questions. Who do you think you are, and don't you know who I am? You know, it's bad enough when those questions are directed at another person. But it gets really bad when they're addressed to God, which is what Pharaoh does here in Exodus chapter 5. Turn to Exodus 5, or if you're there, let's open up the Bible. I want to read verses 1 through 9. It's a lengthy reading, but it's worthwhile to get a taste of what's going on in this man's mind and to then help answer the question that we're going to be looking at, that we're really going to be looking at here in just a moment. In Exodus chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, says, And afterward, Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord? And that's the word Yahweh. Who is Yahweh is what he's saying. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh or the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go. Then they said, The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please, let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, that is to Yahweh our God. Otherwise he will fall upon us with pestilence or with a sword. But the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you draw the people away from their work? Get back to your labors. And Pharaoh said, Look, the people of the land are now many, and you would have them cease from their labors? So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters over the people and their foremen, saying, You are no longer to give the people straw to make brick as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the quota of bricks which they were making previously you shall impose on them. You are not to reduce any of it, because they are lazy. Therefore they cry out, Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let the labor be heavier on the men, and let them work at it, so that they will pay no attention to false words. Well, with this, what we're seeing is the introduction to our study of what we're going to call, Who is God that I should obey him? That's the real question that we're going to answer in our study today. Who is God that I should obey him? And again, the main point of this lesson is to answer that question, not to really address who Pharaoh is and what his problem is. We'll talk about that a little bit. But it's to answer the question, who is God that I should obey him? Because that's the question that Pharaoh asked there in verse 2. In verse 2 he says, Pharaoh said, who is the Lord, or who is Yahweh, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? Now, before we begin our analysis of the text and answer that question, let's get a little bit of background to kind of bring us up to speed. The nation of Israel grew out of the children of Jacob in fulfillment of God's promises to him, to his father Isaac, and to his grandfather Abraham. That's all in the book of Genesis, beginning in chapter 12. Now, at the end of Genesis, they had lived in Egypt for several generations and grown into millions of children from the 12 sons of Jacob. And that's what we see at the beginning of the book of Exodus in Exodus chapter 1, where we saw that their numbers, or we see there in the text, that their numbers had caused one of the pharaohs to get a little nervous. There's so many of them. And so he decided he's going to shrink their numbers, especially the men, by having the boy babies killed. And it's during that time that Moses was born and then protected by God and grew up actually in the court of Pharaoh until one day he sided with his people, with the Israelites, and had to flee off into the wilderness. Decades later, at the age of 80, God called Moses from the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, which is where we'll spend most of our time in just a moment, and said it was time to bring Israel out of Egyptian slavery. And he told Moses, you're my man to lead them out. Moses, you're the guy. And here in Exodus 5 is the beginning of that confrontation that will end with Egypt and the Pharaoh broken by the power of God and Israel set free. When the Pharaoh says, who is God, that are Jehovah, that I should obey him? He's going to find out. Oh boy, is he really going to find out. Now let's look again at how Pharaoh asked the questions, the two questions that we started with here in verse 2. The first one is quite obvious. Look at Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? That's easily seen as a variation of, who do you think you are? His next two statements are a little more difficult to translate, but you can see the connection. The next statements are, I do not know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go. The key to that is the first thing, I. That's what Pharaoh's saying. I don't know who this God is, this Yahweh, this Jehovah guy, and I'm not going to let them go. Don't you, Moses and Aaron, and doesn't this Yahweh God of yours know who I am? That's what he's saying. Because the Pharaoh is basically a firm believer in the concept of divine right. Do you know what the divine right idea is? That was in the Middle Ages and not too long ago even in Europe, where the kings asserted that they were in power, they were in positions as king by God's choice, thus ruling by divine right. And so disobedience to a king was disobedience to God. Pharaoh took it a step further by saying that disobedience to him was disobedience to God because he was divine himself. Now, he didn't get his authority from a God. He got his authority from himself as a God. So his response to Moses, to this request of Moses, bubbled up from that overwhelming sense of just bubbled up, the sense of entitlement and authority. I'm God. Who does this upstart wilderness God named Yahweh or Jehovah or whatever his name is think he is? Who does he think he is? I'm a God. He thinks this is a battle of the gods and thinking, well, hey, I'm on home territory and I'm stronger than this wilderness God that this Moses and Aaron are talking about. The Hebrews, they're my slaves, so if they're slaves, their God is a slave God and I will show my mastery over him. That's what he's thinking. In fact, his ego is so big, he expects to be treated kind of like that judge. And he's expecting who expected the cop, and the king here, Pharaoh, is expecting Moses and Aaron to say, oh, I'm so sorry to have bothered you, sir. I'm so unworthy of you. Please forgive me. I promise it will never happen again. That's the attitude he had. And that's the attitude a lot of people have. But the problem is, for Pharaoh, is that Moses and Aaron knew the truth. They knew the truth. Yahweh is God, and Pharaoh was just a man. And so these two emissaries from Yahweh, instead of saying, yes, sir, oh, I'm so sorry, we shouldn't have bothered you, They pressed the issue in verse 3. Notice what they say. The God of the Hebrews, then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please, they were polite, let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Otherwise he will fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. So they assert that Yahweh's power actually stretches into the Pharaoh's territory. God, Yahweh, their God, can actually reach out and stick his hand, so to speak, into Pharaoh's land and exercise control over Pharaoh's property, because that's how he viewed the Israelites, as his property. And they say that if he doesn't let them go, God may punish the Israelites. So they're saying that Yahweh can reach into Pharaoh's hometown, reach into his house, so to speak, and show who's boss. Well, Pharaoh was having none of that nonsense. Pharaoh said, that's idiotic. That ain't happening. And he told Moses and Aaron that not only is Israel to get back to work, he said, y'all get back to work. You're being lazy. And he decided, I'm going to show them who's in charge. I want to punish them. You want to say that Yahweh may punish them? I'll show you who's in charge and I'll punish you. And so he said, all right, instead of providing the straw for the bricks, you got to go get your straw now. So effectively increased their work, maybe even doubled it, because they had to go out at night to get the straw and come back during the day to make the bricks. And they had to make the same amount of bricks. They didn't get a break. And the key to all of this, the key to understanding his attitude, is what he says at the end of verse 9 here in chapter 5. He says, let the labor be heavier on the men, and let them work at it, so that they will pay no attention to false words. See, Pharaoh thinks that Moses and Aaron are just making stuff up. Kind of like the atheists and people of this world think of us, that when we talk about God or Jehovah or Yahweh, that we're just making stuff up. That's the way Pharaoh felt. And he's saying that the God, Yahweh, is a weak God, if he exists at all. He may not even believe that he actually exists, but except that as a God, he thinks that there are lots of gods, just that he's the most powerful one. And this Yahweh, he's the God of slaves, so he's a weak God because he can't control it. He's not our God because he's a slave's God. And so his words have zero power in my territory and over my property. Who does he think he is to challenge me? I'm going to show him who's the boss around here. That's the way Pharaoh's thinking. Well, that leads us to our question. Who is God that I should obey him? Because that's what Pharaoh, those are his first words. That's what he says. Those are his first words in verse 2. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Who's God that I should do what he said? Who is this guy that I should do what he said, that I should obey him? Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to go back to Exodus chapter 3, go back a couple pages in your Bible and look in Exodus chapter 3, and we'll spend the rest of our time there in Exodus 3, looking at who this God is. Who is Yahweh? Who is Jehovah? Because in Exodus chapter 3, Yahweh presents himself to Moses, and his presentation of himself, or his self-presentation, is vastly different from Pharaoh's. Pharaoh is all chest puffed out, beating his own chest, tooting his own horn, patting himself on the back, lifting himself up. Do you know who I am? God doesn't bother with any of that. In fact, he doesn't even bother with that until Moses makes him identify himself. It's like, you know who I am, it's no big deal. It's understood, it's recognized. So there's no need for me to go through all those motions of self-congratulation and self-elevation. I am who I am, as we'll see, he says in a moment. Now, there are three aspects of God that we see here in the text. The first one is that God is holy. God is holy, and that's in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Then God is engaged, that's involved in Israel, that's in verses 7 through 12. And then the third one is that God is self-existent, and that's in verses 13 through 15. And all of these are valuable. And the problem that I have, as you probably have come to see from the studies if you've watched any of the other videos, is where do I stop? So it's not where do I start, it's where do I stop? I could spend the whole several set of sermons on this first point. God is holy. God is holy from chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Let's look at the holiness of God here and for just a few moments, and then we'll look at the others as well. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Here was old Moses watching sheep in the wilderness, and he spotted a burning bush that was burning up, or that wasn't burning up actually. And however far away Moses was from it when he first noticed the bush, he knew that at some point it should be consumed and the fire would dwindle or go out completely. But when it didn't burn itself out, he became curious and decided, I need to go check this out. This is strange. What is this? And so when he got there, God's messenger, an angel, notice in verse 2 that God's not literally there. He's there in the presence, present there in the form of the messenger, an angel. He sends a representative there for him. But he says, Moses comes to the bush, and so God's messenger, this angel, tells him to take off your sandals. You're standing on holy ground. And don't come any closer. You're holy. This is holy ground. Now, what is holy ground? Holy is one of those words that, it's one of those words we just have all kinds of meanings for, and it means all kinds of things, different things to different people. Well, it really just is a simple word that isn't always religious. And it simply means to set apart for a specific purpose and therefore make it very special. Now, when it's applied to God, it takes on a very special meaning of purity, unspoiled, untainted by things that are common. In other words, God is separated from the common. He is distinct and unique, different from everything and everyone else. In Exodus chapter 15, turn over a few pages in your Bible to Exodus chapter 15. There we see where God is described as and the song of Moses. They come out of Egypt, and Pharaoh has learned, quite possibly by dying actually, that this Yahweh is God and I'm not. But in Exodus chapter 15 and verse 11, Moses sings this song, and he says, Who is like you among the gods, O Lord? It's kind of it's a poke at Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, I'm a god, and Jehovah or Yahweh is a lesser god. Well, Moses is saying, there's no God like you. You're it. You're the only one. You're unique. You're special. You're unspoiled. You're untainted by the smallness of man like Pharaoh was. God is separated from the common. He's distinct and unique. He's different from everything and everyone else. Because Pharaoh wasn't, thought he was, and wasn't. But let's go back to Exodus chapter 3. So back in Exodus chapter 3, like I said, we could go look at a bunch of other passages, but we're not going to do that. In Exodus chapter 3, let's go back there, and we see that because God's representative is in the fire, the area becomes sacred because it was connected to the Holy One himself. Now, if you want to do some additional study, I would say go read Leviticus. Leviticus is one of those books that people read it and their eyes start glazing over and they start drifting off to sleep because it's all these laws and laws and laws. But the thing about that is that it tells us about the nature of God. And if you read through there, you see why God wants them to behave in these ways. But in the process of telling them this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it, he basically says you do this because of who I am. Because I'm Yahweh, and because I'm Yahweh, I'm holy. In fact, in chapter 19 and verse 2, he tells Moses, tell Israel that they are to be holy because I, Jehovah or Yahweh, am holy. They are to think of themselves as holy, as separate, as set apart, special, untainted from the world, and then to live like that. That's what he's calling on them to do. In fact, Peter quotes that in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 15 and 16, quotes from Leviticus 19 and verse 2, and tells us that Christians, if you're a Christian, you are to be holy. You are to set yourself apart. By becoming a Christian, you're set apart, but then you're to live like it. You're to live a holy life that demonstrates that you actually believe and are holy like God told you to be, like Him. If we're going to follow Jesus, we have to be holy too. Well, let's move on to the second part of the answer and going back to Exodus chapter 3, and this is verses 7 through 12. And verse 7 through 12 gets me an opportunity to use one of my favorite words. I'm going to go ahead and throw it out for you. Anthropomorphic. I'll write it down. Anthro, A-N-T-H-R-O, anthro, P-O, morphic, M-O-R-P-H-I-C. Anthropomorphic. And we see here in this chapter that God is engaged, and He uses a whole bunch of anthropomorphic terms to describe how engaged He was in the events of mankind. If you study much about American history, you're told, and there's some truth to that. I don't know exactly how much it is because I really haven't done that much study of it. And there's debate back and forth. Many of them, like probably George Washington and several, like George Washington and many others, were very devout believers in God. But a lot of them were considered to be deists. In other words, a deist is somebody who believes that God exists, but that being holy did not involve himself in the affairs of man, that God's too busy or too dispassionate, detached from humanity. They saw Him kind of as a cosmic watchmaker who set the universe in motion, got it going, got it in place, and sent it out, and then sat back and watched it work with dispassion. He's just not really interested, not involved, not engaged. In their view, God was not engaged in His creation or with His creation at all. But if we look at this passage, what we see is a very different portrait of God, a very different kind of idea about God. A God who is intimately engaged, very involved with His creation. This passage is just filled with action words, anthropomorphic terms. Now that's a big word, and all it means is to describe in human form. Anthropos is man, or anthropos is man. Morphic is body or form. John 4:24 emphatically declares that God's a spirit. So descriptions of Him having human form is done not because God has ears or hands or a heart or physical attributes like us, like human beings, but He's described those ways to accommodate our understanding so that we'll understand Him better. So notice this. Let's read the text, verses 7 through 12. This is in Exodus 3, verses 7 through 12. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. If I pronounce any of those correctly, I'm shocked. But anyway, now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And God said, He said, certainly I will be with you. And this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. So what He's doing there very clearly is telling them that God is aware. He's using these anthropomorphic terms to describe His engagement with what's going on with Israel. He hasn't forgotten about them. He knows what's happening. He knows what's going on. And notice the terms, the physical terms, the anthropomorphic terms that we see in the text here, okay? First of all, the Lord said, verse 7, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction. Well, God's a spirit. He doesn't have eyes, but He's engaged. He sees. He's aware of. fact, that's what he says at the end of verse 7. I am aware of their sufferings. Then he says, and so he's seen the affliction, and he says, and have given heed to their cry. Now, New American Standard Version is the version that I'm reading from. This is just the New American Standard Version. That's all it is. And it's a very good version, and I guess it's trying to give us the idea of what he's saying, but quite literally, it's, I've heard their cry. He heard it. Well, when you hear something, there's two ways of hearing it. You can hear it and you can ignore it, or you can hear it and respond to it. If you're a mom and you hear your baby cry, you don't ignore it. You go do something about it. You take care of it. The dad, different story. Different study. We'll talk sometime in the future about parents. But anyway, so he says, I have heard them. I've seen their affliction. I've heard what their cry. They're crying out in pain and misery and because of their suffering. And then in verse 8, I have come down. So he's describing himself in anthropomorphic terms. He's spirit. He doesn't need a body to come down, but he's come down. He sent his angel down, really, actually, in the text, to do what? To deliver them from the power. So he's seen them, he's heard them, and now he's doing something about it. He's engaged. Verse 9 again, I behold, the cry has come to me. He's heard them. He knows what's going on. And then in verse 11, Moses said, but wait a minute, I'm nobody. I'm just this old guy out here tending sheep. My connection to the Pharaohs and that court is 40 years dead. And that guy, this Pharaoh now, isn't going to care anything about me. I have no power. And that's why God says to him, verse 12, Jehovah said, certainly I will be with you. So God's going to go with him. So God's going to be present with him in the process of bringing the Israelites out of their affliction, out of their captivity. The problem with deists, you ever thought about it? I want you to think about it from this standpoint. I don't know how you thought about it in the past, but maybe you have never thought about it. But here's the problem with deists. And it's also the problem with a lot of people that claim to be Christian, by the way, who are not deists. They demand that God be with them and interact and be engaged in their lives just like he was here with Moses and with the Israelites. Visibly, tangibly present. And if he doesn't jump when they say froggy, then in their mind he's disengaged, he's uninvolved. In other words, they're thinking like Pharaoh did in Exodus chapter 5. In their minds, doesn't God know who I am? Who does he think he is? Always, always, always terrible questions. But that's the kind of thinking that's not only in the world among deists, but among a lot of people who call themselves Christians. They're demanding that God be in their lives in a very tangible, physical way so that they'll know he's there. And if he's not, then what's wrong with you, God? Why aren't you doing these things for me? Why aren't you answering my prayers the way I want? Why can't I feel you within me? They're wanting God to come and go at their beck and call. That's just like Pharaoh. Well, let's go back to Exodus chapter 3 and the last part of the question, or the last part of the answer to who is God, that I should obey him. And this last one is in one sense the most significant. But it's also in another sense the most difficult one for us to understand. It's complicated, it's difficult. And that is the self-existence of God. We've talked about how he is holy, that he is engaged, and now we see in verses 13 through 15 that he is self-existent. And that's a concept that we have a really hard time wrapping our heads around because we're not. We're derivative. We derived from our parents, and we depend on air and water and food and all of the things of this life, and we depend on our body to operate the way it's designed to operate, and then at some point it all ends anyway. But God's not like that. God is self-existent. And I think this is where I wanted us to notice the distinction between how Pharaoh just jumped out there. Who does he think he is? I'm not going to listen to him, which is a way of saying, doesn't he know who I am? God doesn't bother with anything. He just says, hey, I'm coming down. I'm going to save my people, and you're going to be the one to take them out of Egypt, bring them out of captivity. All along, God just knew that Moses knew who was talking and saw no need to assert himself like Pharaoh did. There's no sense of, oh, I got to protect myself. I got to make sure that everybody knows who I am. No, no, no. God doesn't have to do that. And even here, when he's asked to identify himself by name, God wasn't boasting or chest beating like the judge or like Pharaoh. Don't you know who I am? No, he doesn't bother with any of that. Instead, he made a simple statement that may be the most profound statement of all. That's when he says, I am that I am. Let's read the text. Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 through 15. Then Moses said to God, Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, Well, what's his name? What is his name? What shall I say to them? And a lot of times people read this and they try to say, well, God's aggravated at Moses. Well, God rebukes Moses a little bit later, but right now he gives him a simple answer. Verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God furthermore said to Moses, Thus shall you say to the sons of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. I am, or Yahweh, or Jehovah. You may hear this phrase Jehovah or Yahweh. That's the name that he says for himself. By the way, for those who deny the deity of Christ, Jesus assumes the name I am, identifies himself as the self-existent one as well. But again, that's another study for another day. When God says, I am that I am, it's a simple first-person verb declaring self-existence. And of course, inherent in that self-existence is power without limit, because he's outside of all limits of time, space, and matter. Time, space, and matter, nature as we know it, the universe as we know it, didn't exist. It was not there. And then God spoke it into existence. He created the laws of nature. He created physics. He created mathematics. All of those things that we see as part of nature all came as a result of God's creation. They arose out of him. He's not bound by it or tied to it. He made it happen because he wanted to, out of his self-proclaimed desire and out of his own power. Last time we talked, does God exist? If you haven't seen that video, go back and watch it. Does God exist? Please go watch it. And what we talked about there is how the atheist denies that God is eternal. And they also deny that matter, time, space, and matter are eternal. And by doing that, they're trapped on this eternal, irrational loop. There is nothing is eternal. Nothing exists, then boom, something came into being. How did it happen? They don't have an answer. We do. God is the break from that irrational loop of, well, how did we get here? Where did everything come from? Everything came from a God who eternally exists. It's because matter has to exist for eternity or God has to exist for eternity. It's one or the other. And scientist says neither. Well, then how did we get here if there was a time when there was nothing? See why I say it's an irrational loop? God, on the other hand, had no beginning, no end, no middle, no limitations of any kind. And of course we struggle with this because we have a beginning and we have a middle and an end. We're born, we live, then we did die. And we can't wrap our heads really around eternity. But that's God, eternity. He didn't have a beginning. He doesn't really have a middle and he doesn't have an end. He always was. He is and always will be. One author put it this way, and I like this because it's kind of catchy, and it gives us some perspective on the eternal nature of God. When he says I am, it's the verb to be, to exist, and it includes past, present, and future. It is everything, past, present, and future, all at once. And here's how this author put it. He says, I was what I was what I am, I was what I will be, past, present, future. I am, present, what I was, past. I am what I am, present. I am what I will be, future. I will be what I was, future and past. I will be what I am, future and present. I will be what I will be, future in the future. God is all of those things. That's what he's saying when he says, tell them I am sent you. Well, now that we know God is holy, God is engaged, and God is self-existent, the real question is, why would we not want to obey him? In fact, perhaps a better question even is, who are we to disobey him? Think about it. Especially when he offers salvation to all who will obey. So who are we to not obey? Why would we not want to obey? And so if you have any questions about what God requires to be saved, then reach out to me. Facebook Messenger or by email at anamericanmissionarybg@gmail.com. Reach out to me and I'll be happy to discuss with you and give you some guidance, and we can study together on what God wants you to do to obey him so that you can receive the salvation that he has promised and offered to all who will obey him. Who is God that we should obey him? Who are we not to obey God? Well, thank you for watching. And until next time, this is James McClenny. I'm James McClenny, praying that your heart will be filled with the glory of God.